April 4th is the 60th anniversary of NATO, and a summit of NATO leaders is currently underway in Strasbourg, France. NATO comes to its 60th anniversary, doubled in size from when it was founded in 1949. It has developed greater reach and expanded its role as witnessed by current NATO's mission in Afghanistan. Undoubtedly, the discussions at Strasbourg will impact Canadians further. There are reports about discussions at the summit concerning economic instability leading to security instability in the world, and what role NATO may play as this develops. Therefore, as NATO leaders meet to discuss the future of NATO, it is important that Canadians also engage in that discussion. The question to be resolved is a simple one. Should Canada remain in NATO? We have asked Henry Heller and James Ferguson because both are eminently qualified to discuss the changes we are living through as the world is redefined in the post-Cold War period and the particular dynamics that have emerged in this, the first decade of the 21st century. Henry Heller is a professor of history at the University of Manitoba. He received his BA at the University of Michigan and his PhD at Cornell University. His most recent publication, released in January 2006 and published by Monthly Review Press, is The Cold War and the New Imperialism, A Global History, 1945 to 2005. A review of the book noted that it is, quote, an account of global history since 1945, which ties together the narrative of the Cold War to that of neoliberalism and the new imperialism in ways that illuminate and clarify the dilemmas of the present moment. His other recent work is The Bourgeois Revolution in France, 1789 to 1815, published by Bergen Books in May 2006. Dr. James Ferguson is the director of the Center for Defense and Security Studies and professor in the Department of Political Studies at the University of Manitoba. He received his BA honors and MA degrees from the University of Manitoba and his PhD from the University of British Columbia. As his position suggests, he is an expert on Canadian defense policy. He has lectured and written extensively on Canada's foreign and defense policy through its relationships with NATO and ballistic missile defense. He also regularly lectures to schools of the Canadian Armed Forces. And lastly, our moderator is Terry MacLeod. Terry MacLeod has been hosting CBC's Radio 1 morning show in Winnipeg since 1993. Prior to moving Winnipeg, Terry was producer and guest host of CBC Radio's hit network show Morningside with Peter Zowski. He is an active community member and volunteer, and we are very pleased that he has taken the time and interest to be here today. Thank you. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Terry MacLeod.
Well, thanks for coming out on such a beautiful afternoon. This is a subject that I was really pleased when Glenn called and asked me if I'd be part of this, because it's something that I'm really curious about, and to be part of a discussion and to listen to two people who've thought deeply about this, for me, is a really useful thing to have done. So I'm very curious as to how the afternoon will unfold. I should mention the format as well. There will be an opening statement from each of our presenters. There will be a rebuttal of 5 minutes each, and then questions or comments from you, and then a 5-minute summation. We flipped a coin to begin, and James got to decide what position he would go in, so he wanted to have the last word, so Professor Heller will be speaking first. You might have heard in the news today that Anders Fogh Rasmussen is now the new head of NATO. That happened today. Albania and Croatia joined NATO today as well. They managed somehow to resolve the disagreements that Prime Minister Erdogan of Turkey had with the issue of whether Mr. Rasmussen was the appropriate candidate to head up NATO. Peter MacKay did not become the new head of NATO, the Canadian. So they were meeting in Strasbourg, and meetings have just wrapped up there, I understand. So we'll begin, and Henry Heller will be going first. The subject for discussion today, should Canada remain in NATO. So Henry Heller, to begin, 15 minutes.
Thank you. It's a wonderful building to be talking in, and I'm glad to hear that it's going to be preserved and take on a new form. Now, the NATO alliance has existed since 1949, and its name is actually the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Well, it's a long way from the North Atlantic to Afghanistan. And the question naturally arises, what the heck is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization doing in Afghanistan? Well, we were told initially it's all about the war against terror. And we know that in the wake of 9/11, in fact, a whole new ideology taking the place of the war against communism, we saw an attempt to, in effect, raise the specter of a war against terror, an indefinitely prolonged war against terror. Well, this didn't wash. It hasn't worked. It hasn't enabled the NATO alliance to redefine its role successfully. After all, the question of terror is really a police matter. And so we see the new administration, which is far cleverer than the last in Washington, increasingly dropping the invoking of the war against terror, justifying the intervention into Afghanistan. And in fact, anybody who really understands what's going on in the Middle East understands that in terms of the instability in that region, there are two fundamental reasons for the instability. In the first place, it is a consequence of the intransigence, the state of Israel, and the power of the Israeli lobby in terms of its ability to manipulate American public policy. And the other reason for this is the operations of the United States in the Middle East, that is to say, the imperialist operations of the United States. So then the question is, what really is the United States and NATO and its half-hearted doing in Afghanistan? Well, in my opinion, certainly oil may be a factor. Some people say that, probably has to do it. To me, it looks like a classic flanking operation, directed against Russia, China, and India, led by the United States. Afghanistan is and has historically been a key geopolitical point, and even more so today. And the control over Afghanistan opens up the possibility of, in fact, making it more feasible to control and to manipulate the relationship between these three powers, India, China, and the United States, following along the line the notion of the containment of Eurasia, that the dominant ocean power needs to contain the Eurasian powers. Well, control over Afghanistan, from this perspective, is important. So I would minimize the question of oil. And this operation, this NATO operation in Afghanistan, has to be seen in conjunction to what NATO, again at the behest of the United States, is doing vis-a-vis Russia following the supposed end of the Cold War. And there we see, in addition to this involvement in Afghanistan, you see the United States basically using NATO where it can, in effect operating in Ukraine, in Georgia, in the so-called stands, the former southern republics of the Soviet Union, and attempting now to install missiles directed at at Russia in Poland and the Czech Republic. Now this strategy on the part of the United States, which there's no sign that Obama is relenting in any way in terms of pursuing this strategy, the Canadian public and the rest of public opinion in Europe and even in the United States is simply not buying this imperialist adventure and is not enthusiastic about it. All the public opinion polls indicate that. that one way or another the public senses that there's something fishy about this. Who is then responsible? Who is behind the promotion of these policies? Well, it is the American, the Canadian, and European military-industrial complex that lies behind this. We're talking about certain corporations, certain geopolitical centers, universities, and military establishments that are pushing this. These are people who have never seen a war that they didn't like, and this is, in effect, a permanent war lobby. In the same way as you have people who are ironmongers, and you have people who sell cars for a living. Well, there are these people who basically sell war, and it's this group of people who have an institutional vested interest. And amongst those is the Strategic Study Center at the University of Manitoba, the strategic, which is represented here this afternoon. This group, their business is selling war for the military-industrial complex in Canada. Now, the last paper that they were involved in was, of course, the dismemberment of Yugoslavia, which took place in the midst of an unprecedented disinformation campaign. Unprecedented. The public today, the world was completely pulled over their eyes, and an extraordinary disinformation was permeated, was promulgated in order to carry out this campaign. There are many publications which both online and elsewhere, which describe this, but one could refer, for example, to the latest, Michael Gibbs, a new work published by Vanderbilt University Press in 2009, Do No Harm, The Destruction of Yugoslavia, coming from an American university press. This is quite interesting, the fact that somebody in the United States has the courage to basically tell the truth about really what happened in Yugoslavia. So what I'm basically arguing this afternoon is that NATO is an offensive, it's an imperialist organization. And the question is, was it ever a defensive organization? Was it ever a defensive alliance, as is basically seen as a result of basically the way it is represented in the Western press and media? Well, 2009 marks its 60th anniversary, but I'm looking at the Canadian case, in terms of the Canadian government now. So I don't start in 1949, because 1949 is being in the middle of things. We really have to go back, instead of 60 years, we have to go back 80 years, 81 years. That is World War I. And in the first place, at the end of World War I, the Canadian invasion of the Soviet Union in 1918, 6,000 troops. 1919, the suppression of the Winnipeg General Strike in 1919. That is to my way of thinking, the crossroads in terms of the development of Canada as a nation and its foreign policy. Because the suppression of communism at home and abroad marks the Canadian state and the business elite from that point onwards. That is its record in the 20th century. That was interrupted by Nazi imperialism. It was interrupted by the rise of Nazi imperialism in the 30s and 1940s. But no sooner did the Second World War end than it immediately resumed. Between 1946 and 1949, we have really the beginnings of the Cold War. The famous Guzenko case marks the start of it in Canada. The key point is the establishment of the West German state in 1949. The establishment of the Federal Republic of Germany is the key point in terms of the consolidation of the Cold War in Europe. And what did the revival of the West German state mean? It meant basically the restoration of West German capitalism was key to the restoration of a capitalist Europe, dominated by the United States of America. This was all sketched out in the Marshall Plan, which was enunciated in June 1948, the year earlier. Now this division of Germany, establishment of the West German state, in fact, if you look at really what went on, was a complete violation of the wartime agreements between the wartime allies, and was designed to thrust the Soviet Union back into isolation. That's what its fundamental purpose was, in addition to restoring West European capitalism. NATO was simply the aegis, the military aspect, the military aegis under which this reconsolidation of the West German state and restoration of West European capitalism occurred. To conclude, Canada was a founding and full participant in this program, a founding and full participant. In fact, Canada, what is Canada in terms of this history? Canada is the Sancho Panza to the American Don Quixote. This is what the role of Canada has been. And as to the question posed today, Canada out of NATO, it's conceivable, but understand what it would mean. To take Canada out of NATO would mean a fundamental political and social change in the very fabric of this country. I'll conclude.
Thank you, Professor Heller. So that's about 10 minutes for Professor Heller, and we'll turn now to James Ferguson. You have 15 minutes if you wish.
I don't get Henry's extra 5.
Thank you, Ed. Let me first express my thanks to the Peace Alliance for the invitation to be here today. And let me applaud the Peace Alliance. As noted, this is the 60th anniversary of NATO. And I think it's always important for the public to engage in issues about NATO, among other important international institutions, and certainly important aspects of Canadian foreign and defense policy. This, to my knowledge, is the only public meeting that's being held on the occasion of the 60th anniversary of NATO. I think it's very important. Again, my applaud to the Manitoba Peace Alliance. The question of should Canada remain in NATO, I think, is an important and certainly a legitimate question. But I would suggest to you, in part, and my colleague, Dr. Heller, hinted at this, that it's a bit of a misplaced question. Because I think the real question we want to consider, and I will raise from my view why it is I think Canada should stay in NATO, but the real question is based upon the reality that Canada will stay in NATO. NATO, since the Treaty of Washington in 1949, which is the founding document of the organization, has always reflected dominant, widespread public consensus in Canada, among most Canadians, about the values of Canada's commitment to Europe and European security. The real question we face is, what should NATO do in the future in recognizing that it has transformed since its fundamental purpose, or raison d'etre, during the Cold War? No one imagined in 1949, nor in 1950 or throughout the Cold War, that NATO would suddenly be commanding forces in Afghanistan. Never mind imagining that NATO would be directly engaged in the former Yugoslavia, Bosnia, and the war against Serbia with regards to Kosovo. No one imagined other out-of-area activities that NATO has undertaken. And one of the central issues, I think, for Canadian policy is what does Canada want NATO to do? As I said, the fundamental importance of NATO to Canada, the widespread public consensus on NATO as an important vehicle for Canadian values and interests stems from a simple set of principles. A long-standing commitment to international peace and security, a long-standing commitment to European security, as witnessed by the deployment of Canadian forces and 100,000 dead in Europe from the function of 2 world wars in the last century, and the reflection that NATO does reflect certain sets of domestic values with regards to multiculturalism, multilateralism, and international organizations. NATO meets all those key elements, notwithstanding debates about what its primary mission should be and is. And it's important, I think, to recognize when we think about Canadian interests and values, which I'm going to talk briefly about, It's important to remember that NATO membership, being part of the alliance, is not an end in itself, even though there are some elements within any organization which see things in terms of the life and death of an institution, which is not different from anywhere or any institution domestically or internationally. But in terms of Canadian policy, NATO is a means to a set of ends. Means to a set of ends about Canada's vision, about what the world should look like, and what Canada's role and responsibility should be on the international stage, and the value that NATO can play in terms of meeting its visions, Canada's visions, and meeting its interests on the international stage. We all know that the primary raison d'etre of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization transformed with the end of the Cold War. Its primary purpose, whether you see it in imperialist terms, in power politics terms, in whatever terms you want, who you blame for the Cold War, it doesn't really matter in some ways, because the fundamental purpose, at least for all the member states, when NATO was signed, was based upon a perception of the threat posed by the Soviet Union to Western Europe, the legacy of 2 world wars and the North American commitment to Europe, and the view that NATO as a collective defense organization under Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations played an important role in deterring the Soviet Union, whether they were a real threat or not. It saw itself, the member states saw the organization as an agent of peace, to prevent war rather than to create the conditions for war in Europe. And of course, we can all debate about the meaning of deterrence, etc. It's certainly the case that one of the central issues facing NATO today is, of course, the question of Russia. And I'm not here to suggest to you that there is some hidden conspiracy within NATO designed to recreate a new Cold War, that as a function of NATO enlargement eastward, that we're seeking, or the West is seeking once again, to encircle Russia, contain it, isolate it, deter it, in support of military-industrial interests, etc., etc. I would suggest to you that the question of enlargement to the east and bringing NATO back to the borders of Russia, which is occurring, hasn't occurred yet. Well, it has occurred yet, pardon me, with the Baltic states being a member, and the question of the future membership of Ukraine and Georgia, has to be looked at from a particular perspective. And that is the perspective of what I would suggest are the legitimate fears of East Europeans. Their motives for joining NATO, fears after decades long, if not centuries long, of Russian intervention, Russian actions, their experiences with the Soviet Union during the Cold War in the Eastern Soviet bloc. All these have created fears, and naturally for the East Europeans, they were looking after all those decades, particularly of the Cold War and experiences, as a function of their fears, to find a security assurance against what I would suggest are legitimate concerns of a resurgent hostile Russia to their interests. Whether that's real or not is a different question, but certainly among the East Europeans, if you ask any of them, they will emphasize that that is the importance of NATO to them. Security reassurances against fears of a resurgent hostile Russia. As an alliance of democracies, because all the East Europeans are democracies, as best as we can understand what democracy means, that we do share values with regards to democracy, human rights, and the rules of law. The real question about Canadian membership in NATO, with regards to enlargement eastward and the problems it creates with regards to the relationship with Russia, is whether Canada has a moral responsibility to commit itself to the defense and security of others. Successive Canadian governments, all federal political parties, and the Canadian public at large have recognized and accepted that Canada has a responsibility beyond itself to the global good, to the global community, to international peace and security. In so doing, Canada has rejected the ideas of the interwar period, most clearly expressed by Senator Danderan in the 1920s in the League of Nations, that Canada was a fireproof house, far away from flammable materials, and the isolationist policies it spawned during the interwar period. In other words, to reject NATO is to reject the moral responsibility that our security is inherently linked and tied to the security and the safety of others. It is to communicate to Europe that European peace and security is divisible from Canadian peace and security, Canadian and North American peace and security. And indeed, this is to suggest that Canadian security is divisible from the rest of the world outside of North America. We can stay home, live in our safe geographic place in the world, and watch the world burn if we like. But it's been the view of Canadians, I think, and Canadian governments, that that is an immoral position on the part of Canada. I would add that NATO is also much more than simply, of course, this fundamental security commitment and reassurance that security is not divisible, that we're all in it together. NATO is much more than Article 5, which is the collective defense agreement, which commits us to come to the defense of our allies in the cases that they were attacked, particularly since the end of the Cold War. Without going into detail, NATO played a significant role, and Canada supported the role through the Partnership for Peace program, which provided valuable assistance to the East Europeans, and now beyond the Eastern Europeans, into the places of the world that Henry says are part of the great American imperial conspiracy. But they played an important role establishing fundamentals about democracy, particularly when it came to the relationship between civil political authorities, democratically elected authorities, and military forces. It was one of the prerequisites for NATO membership, was to develop these types of arrangements so that these states would evolve from their previous state, dictatorial states, into healthy functioning democracies with a healthy relationship between civil authorities and the military. It served an important stability function in all the issues that confronted the East Europeans in the transition points, where there were lingering ethnic tensions, disputes about borders, and a variety of issues which could have sparked war in Europe. NATO played a very role providing that stability in capturing the East Europeans and promoting stable evolution to democracy. Moreover, NATO is a vital enabler for Canada's involvement on the international stage. I think most Canadians would agree and applaud and recognize the valuable role that Canada has played in peace, what we call now peace support operations and peacekeeping operations on the international stage. Many of these valuable functions we have played would not have been possible without the NATO alliance. Decades of long, effective, functional military political cooperation between Canada, the United States, and our European allies facilitated the efficient and effective use and employment of limited Canadian military forces on UN missions, and then since the end of the Cold War, on missions that, except for the Kosovo War, of course, which have been sanctioned by the United Nations Security Council, as in the case of Afghanistan, but undertaken by other institutions or organizations, in this case, NATO. Nothing I would add commits Canada in the Treaty of Washington through NATO to send peace support operations forces under a NATO command to an area outside of the NATO area of operations. Article 5 does not extend to Afghanistan. It does not extend outside of the members of the alliance. These are discretionary commitments in which Canada has to make a choice of which institution it wishes to work with, which it wishes to work through. But what it does, it provides that foundation which enables us to cooperate effectively with the Germans, the Norwegians, the French, the Spanish, the Italians, and everyone else in the alliance, so that when we go overseas with like-minded nations, in coalitions of the willing to manage conflicts elsewhere, to prevent the slaughter of thousands of people which we see occurring every day, which occurred, of course, in Bosnia, and NATO responded after the failures of the United Nations Protection Force. All this is facilitated by the value of functional cooperation. And perhaps that's all NATO outside of the collective defense role it still plays in Europe, and Canada's symbol of Canada's commitment to the security of Europe. Perhaps that's all we want NATO to do. And that's valuable in and of itself. I, among others, have questions about whether NATO should be in Afghanistan, and what role it should be playing as an international organization outside of Europe. But that does not undermine the value of the cooperation that goes on, politically and militarily, between all the allies, which then have value and benefits beyond simply Europe. Moreover, to think about ending our commitment to NATO has serious other impacts upon Canada. For Canadians who are concerned about our too close relationship militarily, economically, and socially with the United States, to leave NATO is to, in fact, make us more dependent upon the United States. It will leave us here alone. And it's always been one of the pillars of Canadian policy that we're better off with others, in part in managing our relationship with the United States, for good or ill. In addition, NATO gives us access to information about European political interests, about political goals, about capabilities, which extend not just to Europe, but beyond Europe to the world as a whole. We are not a superpower. We have no pretensions to be a superpower. We are a medium power with limited capabilities, but with global interests, and a desire to shape the world, or do our part to try to shape the world on the basis of vision of liberal democracy, of human rights, and the rule of law. This requires knowledge about the world which we can hope to obtain on our own. But by interacting with our allies, we have that ability to learn much, much more, know much, much more what's going on a global basis, which facilitates our international responsibilities. I would conclude by also adding that the NATO commitment for Canada reflects Canada's commitment to multilateralism, to international institutions, and to global interdependence. During the Cold War, NATO was overwhelmed by the Article 5 commitments in the light of perceptions about the threat of the Soviet Union. But it's important to remember that when Canada pushed for the negotiations to sign the Treaty of Washington, and played a key role in getting the most reluctant player to extend its commitment to Europe, the United States, having engaged, that Canada forcefully fought to have included in the Treaty of Washington the long-forgotten Article 2, which talks about NATO representing, the Treaty of Washington more accurately, representing a North Atlantic community of shared values with regards to human rights, democracy, the rules of law, about cooperation not just militarily, but politically, socially, and economically.
1 minute.
That's all been forgotten because of the Cold War, and increasingly Canada has done very little to try and take the opportunities of the post-Cold War world to push NATO, to push the North Atlantic community idea further where its original founders and thinkers such as Lester Pearson thought it should go. To reject NATO, in other words, which is Canada's only formal political link to Europe, symbolizes a rejection of the idea of the North Atlantic community. It would be ironic indeed, I think, for a nation who believes in the importance of multilateralism and its international institutions governed by formal rules, to reject one such institution. Perhaps that's where our efforts need to go, in NATO, rather than the focus upon Afghanistan or elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you, James Ferguson. Now, with a 5-minute rebuttal, Professor Heller.
One notices a lack of empirical reference in the speech we just heard. The sort of banalities and generalities are thrown around. Fine, lenifying words are used, but there's an absence of real engagement with what exactly NATO and Canada has been up to in terms of its real effects on human beings. It's just words like consensus, values and interests, security. No one asks here, security for who? And under what circumstances? It's just security. Basically, what we heard in response to my speech is basically an attempt to pull the wool over one's eyes by using this kind of phraseology. At least we've spared the notion that Canada and the rest of NATO are going to defend women. They've given up that one because they've been embarrassed in the last few days over this historic use of women as saving women, which goes back to British conquest of India in the 18th century. Their basic project was to save British women and also the honor of Indian women. This is why they conquered India. As for the East Europeans and the great things that NATO and the West have done with respect to East Europe, I'm afraid Professor Ferguson's references lack all real context in terms of what has happened in Eastern Europe, where a small liberal elite lead to Western Europe and the United States and basically seize control of not only the political life, but the economic life of Eastern Europe. The population has been incredibly immiserated. Actual political participation in the so-called democratic political processes minuscule, and people are terrified over the prospect of, in effect, the implantation of NATO and its weapons in Eastern Europe. But meanwhile, we hear about how all of this is sort of facilitating security and peace. No question about words like consensus are bandied about. Consensus, how is consensus created in the first place? Words like values and interests of Canadians. Whose values, whose interests are at stake? No specifics. And finally, by no means do I advocate isolation. Not at all. We're talking about the one bright prospect or positive aspect of Canadian foreign policy. That is to say, its role in working through the United Nations as a mechanism for promoting international peace and cooperation. There's nothing that the attempt on the part of the speaker to confuse NATO, this aggressive military alliance with the United Nations, to my way of thinking, is simply insidious. The two have to be kept clearly separated.
Thank you, Professor Heller. And James Ferguson, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Conspiracy thinking is a lovely thing. It takes a complicated world with complicated political forces, social forces, and economic forces at play, wraps up in a nice little box for you, and provides easy answers to deal with the complexities that we face. I wouldn't sit here, even though I'm not a member, although I've been argued many times I'm a member of the military-industrial complex. I always find that term rather strange. I'm not sure if people who discover or investigate causes of diseases, like cancer, are part of the health-industrial complex, because it is in their organizational interest to ensure that there's sickness and disease so that they can get money to build the world they want to build. I'm not going to sit here in front of you and say that there isn't military interest, that militaries don't have institutions, institutional interests, that industries like any industry has interests. To suggest that the Western world, the democracies of Western Europe and North America are being run by a military-industrial complex is really simply far-fetched. There are a lot of political interests at play. And we have to recognize the different political interests which all come together or work together in certain ways that result in public policy. Public policy, which of course trying to deal with a difficult, complicated world, is never black and white. Succeeds, fails, depends on your political perspectives. I'm not sure what the debate about empirical evidence is. I can point to you to numerous polls in Eastern Europe about the widespread public support for NATO membership. Is life better? Perhaps the East Europeans would like to go back to the rosy days of the Soviet bloc and the Soviet dictatorships throughout the East. Seems to me they're not that interested because they quickly threw them all out. There is evidence out there which we can all point to. You ask the people of Bosnia what they think of NATO. I'm pretty sure you know what the answer will be after the horrors they faced when the former Yugoslavia collapsed. UNPROFOR failed to do its job. The United Nations, Canada involved, failed to do its job to protect the citizens of Bosnia. And it was NATO that came in mandated by the Security Council. You can't pick and choose the United Nations when you want, when you like it and when you don't like it. Canada, NATO is in Afghanistan. Oh, by the way, Canada is in Afghanistan. I want to emphasize this. Went to Afghanistan in 2002, not because of NATO. Henry is right about one thing. We went there because of issues surrounding the United States for a variety of political and economic reasons. Not a great conspiracy, not part of some great imperial American desire to win the world, to control and dominate the world, but of practical political reasons related to our relationship with the United States. NATO came along, but let's remember the American involvement, NATO's involvement, more than NATO members in Afghanistan are there under the mandate of the United Nations Security Council. NATO went into Bosnia, into former Yugoslavia, under the mandate of the United Nations Security Council. NATO's involvement and our role, as I've tried to emphasize, our role with regards to NATO and issues out of the European area, relates to the mandate and legitimacy provided by the United Nations Security Council. If you wish to throw Canada out of NATO and not be engaged in NATO, then you better rethink about Canada's involvement with the United Nations as well. Because the United Nations is a political organization, reflecting the interests of the political actors, all the political actors, the states which dominate, which run the organization. You can't separate the two out. There are complicated issues that Canada faces and NATO faces, particularly in managing a relationship with the government of Russia. These are extremely difficult ones. There's no easy answers one way or another, I would suggest to you. But let me point to you one point that's very important with regards to recent decisions, the recent agreement between the United States and Poland. Offensive missiles are prohibited in Europe. Medium-range and theater-range missiles are prohibited in Europe according to the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement signed between the Soviet Union and the United States in 1987. The United States is not putting any offensive missiles into Poland. It's putting 10 interceptors, missile defense interceptors, which pose no threat whatsoever to Russian strategic forces, of 2,000 plus warheads. And its location and the physics and technology of this is all dealing with rising concerns about the threat posed by nuclear proliferation, missile proliferation in the Middle East. That's what's going on there.
1 minute.
That this is being manipulated and played by the various political actors in Europe, the Russians, is not surprising. It's part of the way the world works, whether we like it or not. Canada can say, we don't like this world, and we can go home, because that's essentially the argument that is being made. It's arbitrary to think that we can pick and choose and go away and pretend that part of the world is not important to us and others parts is. NATO is part of a package of multilateral commitments to international peace and security. If we don't want to do that, then the effective answer is we will go home, and we will be isolationists. We may make lovely rhetorical statements from Ottawa and elsewhere about how nice and good we are. But if we're not willing to do something, if we're not willing to put up national treasure, then that's just rhetoric. It just makes us feel good, but it has no impact on the world whatsoever.
Thank you. So that's two presentations, two rebuttals. It's time for you to offer questions as you wish. We have some time set aside for that. It'd be nice to hear as many questions as possible, and based on the presentations, the rebuttals, or points of view that you brought with you. Yes? Could you stand up so that we can all hear you? The sound doesn't travel all the way.
Just the thoughts about this is a presentation on NATO. Thank you, by the way, for coming. It was good having you guys, both of you, present. But the whole idea about thinking NATO, you see American power is powerful, so like they influence things, right? But I mean, really, most of NATO's current missions right now are to defend American power, and sadly, by extension, also Israeli power. Like, we're fighting terrorists in Afghanistan because these people commit human rights abuses, which is very true. However, so does Israel, so does Saudi Arabia, So does Russia, so does China, so does Thailand. I'm going to start bombing these countries as well. Why are we only fighting to defend American interests? If this is an alliance, like North Atlantic Treaty Organization, why are we only picking fights with America's enemies? So, I mean, NATO was formed during the Cold War. When Russia and America had a bit of a spat. They both believe the world belongs to them. They both believe they have control over the whole world. And as USSR, as Russia is no less imperialist than America is. But why are we getting into this fight between them? Like, NATO was not formed to defend democracy. It was not formed to defend Europe. It was formed to protect American interests against Russia, now against supposed terrorists in the Middle East that are going to blow the whole world up. We talk about nuclear proliferation in the Middle East. We talk about nuclear problems. Israel has nuclear weapons. So do many other countries that abuse human rights. Yet we're only concerned about Iran. Why is this happening? Just a few comments. Thanks for speaking again.
Is that a question to both of the panels?
Mostly to Mr. Ferguson, but to both panels. Yeah, I would like to hear both opinions. Thank you.
If I could ask.
Both speakers, please speak into the mic.
Yes.
Okay. This question, this gentleman raises important specific points, important questions, and they're rooted in very specific situations. And it's heartening to see that people are figuring it, are working it through, rationally, thinking it out. How do these banalities and generalities relate to the actual circumstances in various quarters of the world? And it's clear to me that the questions that you're putting, there's no way that this gentleman to my right can really, unless he just blows more smoke, can really address them.
Would you like to?
I'll give it a shot. I mean, those are very important questions. Canada spends roughly 1.2% of its gross domestic product on national defense, on the armed forces. I think we all recognize, despite the evils of war, the problems of armed force, that there are circumstances, particularly if you are an adherent to or believer in the UN responsibility to protect document, where armed force is necessary. As I said, Canada is a medium power with global interests, as we should have global interests, visions about the world. To suggest that, and I'm not going to disagree with you, the United States has its interests, the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, you name them, everyone's got their national interests. The problem for Canada is because we are simply a medium power, because we aren't willing to invest more in the capacity for Canada to act on its own, we become extremely dependent upon the opportunities that arise in the international community. Whether it's from the United States or whether it's from other powers which work their way through the United Nations processes and other multilateral institutions. There's no shortage, you're dead right, there's no shortage of places in the world where we should be. Take a look at Africa, we all know the whole list of countries in Africa and elsewhere, the problems of the Middle East. But Canada doesn't have the resources, nor has expressed the will to undertake a much greater role. Or in other words, we respond to the opportunities that arise, as they did in East Timor, for example, when that issue suddenly emerged on the political agenda with the United States. That opportunity, East Timor, was one of many conflicts out there. It arose. What did Canada do with our limited resources stretched to the breaking point? Canada responded. And it's been that tradition in Canadian policy where when the opportunities arise, and a lot of it a function, and I agree with you, of American power and American interests as a superpower, which we shouldn't be surprised about, that we end up talking to them. And it's also linked strongly to the fact that no matter what you fundamentally believe about the United States, that we, the United States, the Europeans, share certain common values about the world. Has American power been misused? Of course. course it has. I don't know anyone whose power hasn't been misused. It's a very difficult, complicated issue. The issue of Israel's possession of nuclear weapons relative to the question of Iran is a difficult one. But what do you do when you have a country which issues from its own public rhetoric threats about destroying another state? That raises significant concerns. I'm not trying to defend Israel. Israel has its own set of problems. But this is what I suggest to you is the limitations Canadian policy faces. Unless the Canadian public is willing to do partially what the United States do, invest 4 to 5% of your gross domestic product in defense and foreign resources, I don't see any demand in the Canadian public that would force the Canadian government to do that. I think there's a case you could make for it. But unless we're willing to do it, we have limited opportunities, and we have these constraints in which we have no choice. But the evidence tells us that when the opportunities arise, Canada does act. And let me remind you again, Afghanistan is a UN-sanctioned operation.
Now, we'll come back to, we have another question here, but I want to get the first questions out first. So a question from the front.
I think that when you're talking about about 1949 and the establishment of NATO, you got to put it in the context that it existed at that particular time. For those of us who were involved in the struggle at that particular time, you have to remember that the world working class, that actually Russia wasn't the enemy. Russia was the specter that was held up because it was a foreign power and because, Russians were something less than human. After all, they weren't even Christians. So, and of course the same thing takes place now, that the Arab world are not even Christian, so therefore they must be bad. So, but in the context, in 1949, the world working class was on the rise everywhere. Communist parties were massive all over the world, although they were somewhat tame at the time. There was still really growth. I can remember in Toronto, the May Day picnics in Queen's Park, where 10,000 workers would come out. They controlled the trade unions. They controlled all kinds of working class organizations. The radical movement throughout the world. India was on the rise. India was demanding its independence from Britain. So the whole world working class was saying, look, we just fought a world war. We want our rights. And capitalism as a system was terrifying. And NATO was formed not so much as a deterrent against Russia, but it was a threat to the world working class. And it said, this is the power we have, the military power, and if you dare to challenge our power in any country, especially in Europe, where the workers were most advanced, then we will use the might of this power against you. The UN was created to establish peace, and in many ways, I don't think the situation has fundamentally changed. You raised the question of Bosnia. The reason that NATO went into Bosnia was because they couldn't trust the UN, because the UN was not doing the job for imperialism that America wanted. And so NATO has become an instrument of armed might against the working class everywhere. And I think that's really what the problem is. And I don't see that as changed any particularly. It just occurred to me that if you're talking about NATO as an instrument of peace against, even if you were talking about against communism, surely isn't it not true that NATO has conducted more murders and more wars against the world population, 10 times as many as come from the working class or even from the Arab world today? I mean, what happened in at 9/11 was a terrible tragedy. There's no question about that. But that didn't justify the Americans going into Iraq and murdering 100 times as many people. It's just that how can you talk about NATO and about world capitalism as being a peace organization when it conducts itself in that way?
Any response from the panel?
I guess I would just again say, I'm delighted that the audience is bringing up specific cases. The only way that you can sort of confront these generalities that are being thrown around about peace and security and so on that have no relationship. In fact, this gentleman has brought out that there are times when our government, even the Harper government, I'll concede, has the general interest of the Canadian population at heart. It's rare, but there are occasions, maybe in flood or something like that. But we have to understand that the governments and what they do and their security arrangements are, in part, they're directed against us. And therefore, one has to understand what are they doing over in Iraq? What are they doing over in Afghanistan? What are they doing in Africa, really? To what degree are they really concerned about the people there? What really aren't they really concerned about the resources? Having control of these countries? Isn't that really their concern? There is this notion of somehow automatically we're supposed to bow down to the notion that we're all in this together. It has to be critically evaluated. Are we, in fact, in this together, or is there some divergence between the interests of ordinary people working for a living in Canada and the people who control our governments and the big corporations? I think there is. I may have a binary view of the world. Maybe I'm, paranoid in that way. But it seems to me, based on my life experience, that there seems to be a differentiation here. I could be confused.
James Ferguson, any response?
Well, quick responses. You are certainly correct that in the wake of World War II, the primary concern, the empirical evidence tells us, the primary concern of Allied governments, before they were Allied, in Europe and in North America, the United States and Canada, was fears of internal revolution as a function of the domination or the popularity of the communist parties in France and elsewhere. You're dead right about that. Which in part drove the economic program, the Marshall Plan. Of course, in Western thinking at the time, and the evidence they had, based upon decades of experience, their concerns was that the communist movements were in fact closely tied to, if not beholden to, the Soviet Union. And their concerns was not per se a working class problem, but in fact the question of subversion from within. And you go through hosts of historical documents in Soviet policy, in the Comintern, etc., about the relationship between the Soviet Union and indigenous or local communist parties in Western Europe and elsewhere. I wouldn't want to count up the record of NATO's murders compared to the wonderful dictatorship of the proletariat in the Soviet Union and elsewhere, and the millions and millions they've murdered. I think NATO's responsibility in that might pale greatly. But let me emphasize one point, and it was the key point, I think, that you made, and it's really problematic in my view. The empirical record, the evidence tells us that the United States was very reluctant to extend the commitment. The NATO that emerges eventually is driven, you're correct, by the United States, but the initial decisions about the Treaty of Washington, really the United States, the American people, wanted to go back to the isolationism of the 20s and 30s. It was very difficult to convince the U.S. government of the day, under Truman, that it needed to, in fact, consider making a permanent military commitment, defense and security commitment to Europe. But if you're concerned about the fact that the Treaty of Washington and NATO is an American beast, the United Nations is an American beast. It was the United States which constructed the United Nations. It was the United States which drove the United Nations. It was the United States which created the international institutions economically, socially, and politically of the post-World War II era. If you think NATO is a beast of the United States, the empirical evidence applies exactly the same to the United Nations. You can't separate the two. It was just the reality of politics at the time, and it's the reality of politics to this day.
Now, there was another question, this woman here first, that you were,
Yes.
I'm just trying to keep track. Sorry.
I'm not trying to be funny, but my question's for you, Terry, partly. I want to know where the media fits into this and why we don't have more debate. I really respect CBC's efforts to get issues out there and get people talking about them, and it's extremely difficult. But I guess my question is, how do we take responsibility through our media, or what can media do about it, or what is media doing about it, and perhaps even how does CBC fit into that, because the private media is not at all interested in anything, in stirring up any controversy or dealing with controversy. It's a general question. I would like anybody who wants to address it, but even Terry could get in on this one if you have an opinion.
Well, I can't speak for the kind of global CBC. I know that, I have this kind of humble little job in the morning in a relatively fast-paced program that focuses on life in this community through the kind of human stories that we try to tell. I'm very interested in this subject. I was pretty pleased when Glenn phoned me and asked me if I was interested to come, because I'm not as well educated on this as I ought to be. And so, was this going to make its way out of the morning show? I don't think so. I don't make the final decisions about what gets on the program.
Well,
And so my own interests, am I here representing the CBC? Well, I work there, but I'm interested in a lot of things. I'm interested in this. So will what I hear today infuse what I do as we program? A program like Ideas spends, an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours sometimes on a deeper explanation or exploration of more complex subject material. I don't know if Rex Murphy is talking tomorrow about NATO. It wouldn't surprise me if he was. I was reading some background material before I came today on cbc.ca. There's good background material about NATO, its history. There are materials out of the CBC archives, both radio and television, going back many years. So in terms of CBC's role in this, I know when NATO began its involvement in, say, Bosnia or in Yugoslavia, in Afghanistan, it's an ongoing debate that gets covered at length in many different ways, in many different formats, on the various platforms of the CBC. It's a subject that still very much lives, and I think the Canadians are conflicted about it. I think that there is a sense of wanting to be engaged in the world. That's the impression that I get about what Canadians want to be doing and doing well. We want to be, we are, after all, the original writers of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and we want to be out there. But at the same time, we're very pained about the, 118 Canadian losses in Afghanistan. Now I heard a deep debate this morning and a conversation with Stockwell Day on the House on the issue of this new law that's being proposed in Afghanistan, affecting the Shia minority there. It sure seems to be alive in the CBC as far as I can see. Should there be more? There are a lot of things competing to get on the CBC, and I can't apologize for what we do. In the grand sweep of the kind of program that we do, are we doing a good job? Well, that's up to you to decide, not for me.
I'd like to hear from the others too on that subject. How do we get this?
Well, I mean,
How
I
do we
think
get
if
this
you
through?
are, and I think that people, the audience, the Canadian audience, understands the constraints under which the CBC operates, that there are clear parameters, or maybe they're not so clear, but there are definite parameters within which the news and the analysis can be offered. I mean, and if you, and I am a listener to the CBC, and I think many of you here are as well, you understand, what is being said and what isn't being said, and so on. That is always being negotiated and renegotiated. There are moments when there's something extraordinary is asserted or developed, and then there are the limits within which things can be said. Happily, we do have on the internet, we have things like Rabble, we have Canadian Dimension, which is getting better in terms of foreign
Real news, we have indie news.
Yeah, we have Monthly Review, we have Counterpunch, we have ZNet, where you will find very significant analysis being offered. And I would urge you to look at those sites. Those are very good sites for getting a deeper sense of what's going on in the world.
He pays the piper, calls the tune.
Professor Ferguson, what's your sense as to how well you think that the media reports on these things, and we send journalists, the CBC sends journalists on regular rotations into Afghanistan. They are embedded journalists. There was a time when CBC fought very much against the concept of sending anyone in an embedded way, and then the conclusion was we'll never get anything proper out of Afghanistan unless we are prepared to hold our noses and do this. How well do you think the media in this country covers the issues that we've been talking about today? Are journalists well enough informed? Are they capable of standing back and being objective and non-biased about it, or are they like the frogs in the pots of boiling water that we don't know that we're immersed in, and that we have a certain mindset that's been, that we're embedded to?
Well, we're all embedded one way or another. We can't escape from where we're embedded in. We can all carry baggage with us. To answer your question, Terry, I think the coverage of Afghanistan, if you want to focus on Afghanistan, has gotten better. I think there has been long-standing a problem at the journalist level in the lack of knowledge and background depth in reporting on not just Afghanistan in the initial days, but on international events as a whole. I mean, my experience talking to most journalists who call me for commentary or some background information is, and again, it's only anecdotal and intuitive, so it's not systematic evidence, is that they've all been trained very well in that technical side of the business of journalism, how to write journalistic articles, which I can't do, op-ed pieces and things I can't do because I don't write that way. They're all very excellent at that. But that has come at a price, and the price is you don't have background experts. You don't have journalists who have that deep knowledge foundation so that they can understand. I mean, I don't even know how many times I've sat down and explained to a journalist what a battalion is, because they just don't know. And that's sort of what they see our roles provide that. It used to be, I think, one of the positive sides of Afghanistan, if there's a positive side to it, has been before Afghanistan, I couldn't have put a name to a defense correspondent in the Canadian media, someone who's an expert on defense. Afghanistan has given, because of their own experiences, because it's been such a public policy issue, has given them a much deeper understanding. Christy Blanchford, to give one example, So I think the reporting is good in Afghanistan, and it's gotten better in Canada because it's a public policy issue. But I think to answer your question, the problem in the media in this country is really a reflection of the problem of Canadian society. Media is a business. Even for the CBC, it's a business. It has a market. We shouldn't ignore that. It responds to what it believes the market is interested in. Every public opinion poll we see in Canada tells us the Canadian public's really not interested about international politics, foreign and defense policy. Canadian public's interested in other things. So the media naturally moves itself to where it thinks, based on what limited evidence it has, where that market is. So if it doesn't believe that the Canadian public is going to be interested in issue X occurring in Europe or what have you, or NATO is simply just a quick report, NATO 60th anniversary report, that's it. Because by and large, the Canadian public's more interested in the loss of 200,000 jobs. They'll focus their attention on that. And it reflects something we've known in Canada for a long time, that the Canadian public at large, given that we live in this faraway place from flammable materials, is very happy, very wealthy, is doing very well, and like most societies, is looking inwards at itself. Until the public makes it clear, demonstrates clearly that there is a market here, then I don't think you're going to get the media to respond to the level which I agree with you that I think needs to be responded to. And it's a bit of a chicken and egg, because if the media started doing more, I think the public would become more interested. But how do you get that thing moving? It's very difficult. In Afghanistan, we've seen it in Afghanistan in terms of if you were to track the level of coverage up and down from the media of Afghanistan. When do we hear from the media of Afghanistan? Well, we rarely hear daily reports from Afghanistan. We hear reports, of course, when Canadian soldiers are killed. We hear reports when there is something that blatantly stands up, such as the issue of the recent legislation, which sort of makes the government look bad. You've been telling us you're doing this for women's rights. Look at this, now it looks bad. So that's sensational. That media people think that'll sell. Marketers think that'll sell. So they run with it. Within 2 days, no matter what, I would suggest to you 2 or 3 days, no matter what happens with regards to Karzai, that legislation, and this whole issue, it will disappear, and the media will you'll forget, the media will forget about it. The public won't know, and no one will know, in effect, how this resolves itself. And we always remember, bureaucracies, governments have a wonderful way of managing these types of problems. Say nothing, do nothing, it will go away.
And a comment here at the back.
I just really am insulted at your comments. I feel that you're suggesting that nobody cares, and the ratings of CBC and Radio-Canada, their news magazines, are very high now, and our government's looking to cut down that source of information. So you're suggesting that democracy is up for sale without, you're just buying that and trying to sell it. So, that we'll only be interested in issues if it affects our little paycheck. I challenge you that Canadians have a much greater compassion and appreciation and analysis than you give us credit for, sir. And I am registering my resentment at this.
I just wanted to say, I agree with you, but I just wanted to, in terms of the CBC, I recall as we were sitting here, there was this guy, James McPhee, and I came of age really during the Vietnam War. He used to report from Washington. Some of you may remember James McPhee. He was outstanding. He told the truth, this guy. He's reporting to the CBC from Washington. It was extraordinary. And at the time when the Americans were trying to just, as they do now, just confuse everybody and so on, he cut right through. And another guy from the CBC, I believe was, Michael McLeod, an outstanding reporter. His reporting of the Vietnam War I mean, I've seen some of the old reportage recently on TV, and it's and I've made a point of studying the history of the Vietnam War. It is amazing footage and analysis, that came out of that period. So, in general, pretty constrained, but sometimes there are amazing things that have happened.
Just quickly, you may misunderstand me. I'm not saying that Canadians don't care. We know Canadians care. Most people care when they find out about horrific events going on in the international stage. But what I was saying, and what I responded to the question is, why do we not get more media attention on these things? Why do we not have something more going on? My answer is that if you look from the actors involved, this is what the media thinks will sell. That's what they're doing. That's what they're in marketing. I mean, it doesn't help the fact that the media, the CBC, the private stations in this country, the private presses, don't have, and have cut back significantly on international correspondence. I mean, when I want to get my international news, I turn on the BBC World Service on Newsworld. I mean, there I get world coverage of events which we never see from the CBC or anyone. Well, why not? You have to ask the question, why is this not happening? And one of the general arguments is that from the media perspective, and it also goes into the political level in Ottawa elsewhere. I mean, for whatever you think the democracy is or isn't, and whether it works or is functioning well or not, politicians do try to respond to what they think the public will reply to. And if they don't think, and they may be wrong, that people do care much more about international foreign policy questions. But if they don't think that, then they're not going to act that way. And that's the fundamental disconnect I'm talking about.
The good news is that if you're an insomniac, there's a great deal of international news available on CBC Radio overnight. When I get up in the morning at 3:30, BBC World Service is on. From 4 till 4:30, Radio Deutsche Welle is on. Radio Polonia from Warsaw, Radio Romania from Bucharest, Radio Netherlands. If you can't sleep, there's a great deal of international news available. There's a section from ABC that's on from 5 until 5:15 that focuses only on the South Pacific Islands. Vanuatu, Papua New Guinea is quite a dense news package from ABC that focuses only on that. So the content is there. It's available on the internet, wrn.org, if you want to hear those broadcasts. There was a man here in the front who had a question first.
Yeah, this conversation has been structured as a debate, but I don't think at the end there's going to be a winner or a loser. In reportage, there's a word that's always interested me, and that's insurgent. And I guess I'm thinking that if there were Russian battalions in the Interlake or Chinese helicopters around the house and then I took up arms, then I guess I would be defined as an insurgent. And so I wonder what it is that allows this term to be applied so easily to people who take up arms against invading foreign powers with huge military apparatus. Professor Heller suggested that NATO's presence, or the American presence in Afghanistan, is a flanking operation vis-a-vis China and Russia. But I'd like to come away from this conversation from you, Professor Ferguson, with as clear as possible a statement about what the Americans are doing in Afghanistan. From where you sit, your perspective, your take on what are the Americans doing in Afghanistan? I mean, I know why Canada, I think I know why Canada, for the great glory of Stephen Harper handled it. But no, the Americans, what are the Americans doing in Afghanistan?
A quick comment on you first. I think it's fascinating why we call people who take up arms nowadays insurgents. I don't know the roots of the concept of insurgent and insurgency and dates back, I think, to the 1950s and 60s. We used to call them guerrillas and rebels back in the older days. And it's interesting how language changes, why it changes, cover different things. Anyway, especially why is the United States in Afghanistan? First of all, I think it's important to remember that after the American funding and support to the Mujahideen to deal with the Soviet Union as part of the Cold War rivalry and struggle between East and West, that the United States washed its hands entirely of Afghanistan. It pulled out, it ignored it. When Al-Qaeda emerged, as the ebb and flow of the Civil War in Afghanistan took place, the United States could have cared less. Canada ignored, we all ignored it. Until, of course, it came back to the door of the United States. I don't see this idea of the great geostrategic importance of Afghanistan that dates back centuries and centuries, millennia, to Afghanistan being the crossroads of the spice routes, China and Russia, and the great game of the 19th century. I don't find any of that convincing at all. There's very little evidence to support that in fact is any driver with this, because if you're trying to manage the issue of Russia, if this is great power issues about Russia and about China and about India, Afghanistan is really marginal in all this. The problem with Afghanistan, economically and politically, in many ways why Afghanistan ends up the way it is today, and what's happened to it, is because no one's really interested in it because it's of very little value. The United States went into Afghanistan. We haven't seen no evidence from what I've seen empirically, from any of the studies done, from any documents released in the United States, that there was any thinking or planning whatsoever to strike at Afghanistan prior to 9/11. After 9/11, someone, I think it's safe to say, someone had to pay for it. And Afghanistan was seen as responsible for, because they gave sanctuary to Al-Qaeda and then refused, as required under the UN mandate, to turn over the Al-Qaeda leadership to the international community. The result was, in effect, that the Taliban government committed an act of war on the United States, and the United States went to war to deal with Afghanistan. But whatever you think of the United States, the type of nation it is, I would suggest to you that the United States went to Afghanistan, which demonstrates to me why the United States is not an imperial power. It's a superpower with global interests and global responsibilities. But it's not an imperial power because most imperial powers would have gone in, dealt with it, and then probably left because of its lack of strategic importance. The United States does carry, for good or ill, how badly they execute it, does carry a crusading mentality about exporting democracy and human rights and capitalist economy, if you like. And it just couldn't, when it went in there, it had to then do something. The international community had to do something. And there was a degree of responsibility, I think, that bore in some American decision makers' minds about what the United States' failure to have done something in the 1990s. Hence, the United States and the Europeans at all, by our own sets of embedded social values and beliefs of what right and wrong is, ended up now trapped into the difficult problem of nation building. And nation building is one thing we know empirically, nation building is a really difficult, hard, long process which democracies aren't very good at. And we all know the difficulties of the problems of Afghanistan, which are partially a function of NATO and the Americans being there, that are partially a function of domestic internal forces, of ethnic forces, of Pakistan's involvement, of Iran, of India, all sorts of forces who are at play. But if you ask me why the United States went, they went because they felt that they had been attacked and that someone needed to pay for this, and that they were not going to allow a hostile government, which they saw as a hostile government who had committed an act of war, not pay a price for it, and that price would be the end of the Taliban government. And then once that was finished, with lack of planning, as we saw in Iraq, and by the way, NATO's not in Iraq, except for some training, so NATO, and the NATO alliance split over Iraq, remember that. most of the NATO lines in running to do with Iraq didn't go. And then they got into this, to go back to Afghanistan, then they got into this difficult question of, well, what do we do? Now that we've done this, now what do we do? Well, we've seen the efforts, the billions of dollars pumped in, and all the problems associated with, and the realization this is a long-term mission. Yes, it's going to come home, because at the end of the day, it's not certainly China or Russia in Afghanistan. The geostrategic map, technology today, and strategic thinking today basically says Afghanistan is irrelevant to this. It's not relevant to India and Pakistan, but they're two different actors.
Now, I just want to let you know, we have about 5 minutes left of the kind of question and answer segment. Professor Heller, and then we'll, sorry, there was someone there, and then you.
Okay. In terms of this response to this, it was interesting, the statement, somebody has to pay as the reason. Somebody has to pay, and then there will be nation building. Following the payment, that is to say, the attack and the killing, there will be nation building. This is what was said here. These are the kind of phrases that are used to justify what the Americans and their buddies are doing in Afghanistan. They're basically, they've killed a lot of people. And as for the nation building, let me tell you, this concept of nation building, well, you know, it has an etymology, it has a trajectory. You know, they used to call it the white man's burden, or the civilizing mission, back in the 19th century. It's rubbish rhetoric. This is what it is. Good governance, nation building.
Democracy.
Yeah, it's this rhetoric. That's what I've been complaining about all afternoon here. We get these words, these phrases that cover murder, a process of murder, and not only murder, but a cycle of murder, because the Americans in there and the Canadians, in terms of what they're doing, they are creating the resistance. They have developed a self-perpetuating cycle of violence that is deeper and deeper and deeper in that society, become pathological. And they have an interest in continuing this. I'm saying that the people who are carrying on, justifying this, they are in the business of war making. That's what I've been trying to say. Institutionally, this is their business. Killing people, or preparing to kill people, making a living off them. And that's what they're doing in Afghanistan.
You had a question?
Yes, I'd be interested in hearing from both the guests on a couple things. Given the realities that there's always going to be a need for some sort of policing force or military force. I saw the movie, for instance, Hotel Rwanda last night.
Which one?
Hotel Rwanda. Yeah, and without a doubt, there was a need for some action, and there wasn't. And given that, you know, you take a look at our world today, and billions and trillions of dollars are going in to support a banking system that really is a black hole. I was wondering, you know, with the way NATO, for instance, is growing, whether, you know, organizations evolve over time, and rather being a military alliance, whether it would become a peace alliance. I'd be interested in hearing that.
Peace alliance.
It would depend on who's in control, who has the control of the instruments. Whether, in fact, the people who created such an international or transformed things in that direction, whether they were made responsible to the public. I mean, one of the things that I tried to suggest is that the people who are doing these things are not responsible to their own democracies in the first place. We're not consulted. Did they consult us about our involvement in Afghanistan? Have has there been any consultation on this matter? We were told, we were given marching orders, and people went. That's the way it works here, and it's worked in other places. Until and unless, in fact, people, let's say, the people of the different states have more control over these establishments, these permanent establishments, there isn't going to be what you, and I think I, would like, as I say, some genuinely democratic international set of institutions that people can have some confidence in.
It's very interesting. I'm not sure how you put that into the practical world of day-to-day politics and day-to-day life. But to answer your question, I mean, it hinges upon what you mean by a peace alliance. And I can try to, in a way, construct an argument, and there is many people like me who are not part of the military-industrial complex, by the way, whatever that beast is, because I can tell you about the great fights within the military-industrial complex about resources. And there's a lot of people in the United States Armed Forces, in the Pentagon, and within the Secret Defense offices who would happily wash their hands and don't want anything to do with Afghanistan or Iraq, and warned about what the problems were. Wasn't in their views that this was what should be done. I mean, I'm not sure what is a peace alliance. If a peace alliance is a collection of nations, democratic nations, who come together to commit themselves to each other, that they will defend each other, and demonstrate empirically, as much as you can demonstrate these things empirically, because you can view it from a variety of different ways, that they are defensive, and they have no offensive, aggressive intent, then I guess that might be a peace alliance, and then is willing to use its resources and use the institution to facilitate peace elsewhere, which includes at times, unfortunately, the use of military force. Well, if that's what you mean by a peace alliance, well, that's what NATO is. Now, you can argue NATO was offensive and aggressive because it had at one time millions of troops deployed in Western Europe. It had nuclear weapons, still has a nuclear first-use policy. That demonstrates its aggressiveness. But then I'm not sure what a peace alliance would look like among sovereign states, democratic sovereign states. We might not like the way democracy works. And God knows I'm fighting with the city, and I don't like the way democracy works right now. But, I mean, that's the only way I can answer that.
Another question?
The question is related to the issue of media. Has been, I think what Professor Ferguson reflected about the market, my impression, I lived in the United States for 6 to 7 years, and I feel that his statements probably more reflect the situation in the US market. My feeling here, from living in Canada now for 5 years, is that the Canadian public probably is more knowledgeable and more interested in international events than the US population was. And I thought that from I follow the CBC, I found that the coverage of the CBC is probably better than I've seen in the US media. Another thing that I noted that hasn't been mentioned here is Al Jazeera English. It's really one of the best news organizations today, and it's a shame it's not on cable here in Canada, but it's available for free on satellite. It can be watched also for free on livestation.com.
Where?
Livestation.com. It can be watched for free, along with all the other news organizations like BBC World and others.
Yeah, there are hearings taking place right now about whether Al Jazeera English will be approved for cable distribution in Canada. And oddly enough, the former chief journalist of the CBC, who retired from us about 3 years ago, is currently the head of Al Jazeera English, Tony Byrne.
I'm sure the NATO 60th anniversary of NATO will analyze and cover in great detail.
We had one more question.
I'll mention one thing, and I guess it's through Glenn and the Peace Alliance. Sometime in the fall, I'm on the board of directors of the Winnipeg branch of the Canadian International Council, which used to be the Canadian Institute for International Affairs. Looks like we will be doing a session, public session with David Berman on Al Jazeera. So when Tony Byrne, pardon me. When that happens, I'll make sure that Glenn gets the information and make sure that you all get a chance to come and see what he has to say. Because I think you're dead right. It's important that that voice should be heard.
Another question in the front?
A comment first. I liked what you said.
People in the back here.
Oh, all right. Well, I liked what you said, Professor, about the way that public policy is formed by this coming together of a variety of interests. And I think that media is one of those interests. I think that was pointed out. And profit or market drivers apply to the CBC as well. But I would suggest that rather than a coming together like a ballet, those interests are more like a clash. So if we're wondering why public policy on war and NATO is messed up, it's probably because the various factors that we think of that go into making democracy clash. Education is another one. Maybe Canadians are more interested in certain things than Americans, and therefore our media is better. I don't really see that. I've lived here all my life. But I wanted to rephrase that previous question about the Peace Alliance, NATO. I wanted to rephrase that and find out what the possibilities are for the evolution of not only NATO, but that triad, the NATO, UN, and the world economy. Do you see the possibility of an evolution of NATO?
Well, the world economy has entered into a deep crisis, and obviously there's going to be huge changes as a result. How this works itself out is really indeterminate. We have no idea how this is going to play out. I would say that certainly, as things stand now, that it seems to me that, and I want to say before I criticize that I think that Obama and Michelle are wonderful. You know, this is all wonderful and historic, but I think that he was placed into power. It's not an accident, and that the powers that be are trying to control the situation as much as they can and make sure that even as the economy sinks, that the people who have power in this world today remain in power. That's really absolutely central to what is happening. It's a question of how deep and how serious things are going to get, and the response of the public. And really, one has the sense that some serious questioning, some serious delegitimization has gone on. There is, one feels underneath, deep democratic forces, influences that are bubbling underneath, but whether they come to the surface and lead to, and this is in my way of thinking, the only way change will happen, is if these democratic forces are able to galvanize themselves, organize themselves, then we will see significant change. Otherwise, the existing institutions will redeploy themselves, will work through, will remain in the saddle, is the way I would put it. This is what they're trying to do. Above all, remain in the saddle, as the the whole system is shaking right now. We'll see, how it plays out. I don't really know. But you're really opening a can of worms here with that question. I would say.
It all depends, I guess, academics are terrible at playing with words. It all depends what you mean by evolve and to what end they're going to evolve. Certainly one of the central issues of the current economic situation, the crisis, is questions about the economic institutions that have governed and produced a modicum of stability in the international economic system since the end of World War II, what we call the Bretton Woods system, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, for all the problems they've had and all the policies they followed, which many people have, of course, affected many lives. There is a notion that these institutions have failed or are failing or have not done what they're supposed to do, and a need to rethink these institutions established in the last days of World War II. So that's going on. The United Nations, we know very well, despite the recognition of the problems of the United Nations, particularly in the field of international peace and security, and the Security Council, the requirements of reform that many people have pointed out about the Security Council, the mechanisms implementing a UN military force, the provisions within the Charter for a UN command structure, despite the constant refrain of this, have failed. And there's nothing that I see that's going to change all that. Thirdly, so that issue is sitting out there. The UN, what it was supposed to do by the original framers, is increasingly people are recognizing that there are fundamental obstacles which it cannot overcome. We can't see how it will overcome them. You have the international institutions of the problems in the economic sector. And then you have the NATO question. Afghanistan will be a watershed for NATO. You will have serious discussions, however this wraps up, particularly with 2011, which is a really, really the important date for the alliance in Afghanistan. It's the deadline of the Afghan Compact. It's the deadline when the Afghan National Army is supposed to be able to take over. But in the wake of Afghanistan, however it turns out, NATO is going to ask serious questions about what its role and function is beyond Europe, which will tie into the United Nations, I think, and issues about what should the UN's relationship be with regional organizations such as NATO. You look at the role that NATO's played behind closed doors along with Canada and others in supporting the development of African Union capabilities so they can develop and implement peace operations much more effectively, at least try to more in Darfur, and the idea of the African Union taking on that role with UN sanction. I think that's evolving. I think you have a lot of these things, I think you're dead right, that are at play right now. I'm not sure how they will sort themselves out, but we are at, for a variety of these reasons, I think a watershed. We're going to see evolution. And I think the debate, as I suggested in my presentation, that the real question for Canada is what role do we want NATO to play as an international security agent? And that's a role we need a public debate on. Unfortunately, I doubt we'll get one.
And we have a summation coming up with 5 minutes from each of the panelists, but we have one more question.
I just want to make a statement.
Just stand up so we can.
There was a refugee from Afghanistan. The comment was we were much better off under the Soviets. So why are we there? Why are we really there?
The question was from a man who had escaped from Afghanistan and then went back and said, we were much better off under the Soviets. So her question is, why are we there? Go ahead.
Well, I mean, the basic reality is that in 1978, in response to the repression under the royal president Daoud, the Communist Party of Afghanistan and the army overthrew this Daoud and set up this new government, whose policy was essentially that of limited, socialization of Afghanistan, but the introduction of a kind of liberal democratic state in Afghanistan under the leadership of the Communist Party. One of the key aspects of that revolutionary government's program was the liberation of women. The liberation of women was absolutely a keystone, along with popular education and so on, and a whole lot of other things, the separation of religion from the state and so on, and an end to this sort of tribal domination feudal domination over the country. And this came at a time when the United States had suffered a whole number of reverses in the Third World. And starting with the Carter administration, continuing Reagan, the response of the United States is that we find that these changes, which were, as I say, were not, they were along the way towards socialism, but they were less than socialism. The United States found these changes unacceptable and raised up the Mujahideen to crush this government. And this is what they did. This is what the United States succeeded in doing. The start of the troubles was the American, based from Pakistan, the American program of destabilizing that government in Afghanistan, in which, in the cities at least, people were better off. I wouldn't say that that was necessarily the case in the countryside, because the countryside continued to be dominated by the tribal leaders and the religious leaders, and that a split developed within the society, and all sorts of complications set in. But there can be no doubt about who was responsible for starting the cycle of violence in Afghanistan. It is the United States of America that started this. This has been obliterated. Nobody remembers, except a few Afghans, what really went on there. And this idea that somehow the U.S. and Canada are liberating Afghanistan, I mean, it's a complete distortion of what is going on in that country. You know, that is really, I think, and certainly it's part of the historic record, but who reads history? Who goes back and looks at really what went on? You know?
That's a somewhat different reading of history that I'm familiar with. Under Mr. Dubček in Czechoslovakia in 1968, he was ousted by the Soviets, or the rebellion counter-revolutionaries, if you will, in Hungary in 1956, recognized that the Soviet Union was only acting to bring democracy to Czechoslovakia and Hungary. But let me leave that alone. Why are we there? Why are we there? I think it reflects the comments that the previous speaker made about in democracy you have the difficulty of managing or dealing with clashing interests who all have voices. Canada is, if you're asking why is Canada in Afghanistan, we're there for lots of reasons. And it's my view that when countries make these types of policy decisions, it's not one thing that drives them. It's multiple factors that drive all the interested actors and players within all the institutions of government, within the public, etc., and how they all are interpreted together. I'm not going to tell you that we're not there, that the United States has no importance to us of why we're in Afghanistan. Of course, because the United States is there, and issues governing Canada-U.S. relations are one of the reasons we are in Afghanistan. We'd all be naive and foolish to think not, and I'm not going to try and pretend. Are we there because of Europe? Partially, as NATO got involved, we got there, and that raised issues about NATO and what we saw the importance of NATO. The government thinks the importance of NATO is real or imaginary. That started to play. Was there concerns right after 9/11 about the war on terror? The infamous Americans who love to call everything they do in public policies a term that they want to to get rid of is the war. We've had war on drugs, war on obviously American obsession. Are we there because of the response to that? Yes, we are there because of that response to that, of a terrorist organization which committed an act in the United States which affected Canada, and concerns about a nation harboring, giving sanctuary to terrorists. We are there for that reason as well. We are also there for humanitarian reasons. I mean, anyone in the Canadian government, anyone you want to talk to will say we are also there for nation-building humanitarian reasons, for all those reasons that Henry said the Soviet Union was there. We also are there for that reason as well. And we're there for a broader commitment from Canada to international peace and security, the moral responsibility. All those things resonate among all the forces in Canada. And trying to sort those all up with all the events on the ground in Afghanistan is extremely difficult.
Well, shall we conclude the question and answer segment and have the summation? And since James Ferguson won the toss, Henry Heller goes first with a 5-minute summation, if you wish.
No, I don't wish to. I don't think we need to.
Okay.
People want to go out in the sun as soon as they can. That'd be good for them. So there's no point.
Dr. Ferguson, do you have any comments that you'd like to conclude? Holding people back from the sunshine.
No, I'll let them go. All I would say, all I would say is this is important to have these discussions. And I wish the government would become more engaged with the Canadian public in these types of forums to talk about these important issues.
Well, thank you both, and thank you all for coming, and let's keep talking about this.